I've been thinking about our community as a rock, a big, steady rock held together by intention and gravity and time. A boulder that anchors us, holds us in turbulence, in a storm. And then the pandemic and all of its upheaval was like a giant mallet smashing that big rock and scattering it in a bunch of pieces all over the place. We were both smashed and scattered. And now we're gathering our pieces back together. One of our members, a person who loves people and community, hated the smashing. She hated it, but she also adjusted to it. And she shifted the rhythms of her life to circle around her family and working from home. She's been slow to venture back into the busyness of the world, happy where she is right now. Jennifer, she said to me, I've gotten used to living a much smaller life. Human beings, despite our general dislike of change, are incredibly adaptable creatures. When massive changes hit, it rocks us, but we learn to adapt and survive in the new world. For many of us now, our circles are smaller and our movements are slower, which is not a bad thing. The pace that we were living at before might have been unsustainable, and it is certainly unsustainable in how we're wired now. Our wiring has changed. Stress has an effect on our brains, and high degrees of prolonged stress rewire the brain's functioning. Cortisol and other stress hormones like adrenaline are designed to help your body respond to threat. And in non-stress situations, cortisol helps manage other bodily functions, things like regulating blood pressure and blood sugar, reducing inflammation. But when we move out of acute stress, out of a particular moment of threat to which we can respond, and into chronic stress, the stress hormones like cortisol can negatively affect our bodies and our brains. Cortisol ends up increasing inflammation instead of reducing it and dysregulating blood pressure and blood sugar. Even more, chronic stress hormones impair our ability to think, to manage our emotions, and therefore to manage our behavior. When your brain is operating in threat response mode all the time, chronically, your capacity to learn and remember and pay attention is reduced. Long-term chronic stress makes us less adaptable, less attentive, and more likely to be overwhelmed by our emotions and then behave in ways that are out of alignment with our values. It is very normal to respond to stress overwhelm by withdrawing, by turning inward and reducing outside noise and stress and busyness, that stuff out there that's overwhelming the stress response system. It's an instinctual response to pull the resources in, hide, hunker down, and soothe our nervous systems. And when stress is chronic, a chronic withdrawal response can lead to isolation. And ironically, isolation introduces a new type of stress. Studies have shown that our social connections are fundamental to our health and well-being, our physical and our mental health. They're so important, in fact, that decreases in those connections can increase mortality rates by up to 30%. And it's not just the primary support system that's important to our health. It's actually the further out ring, the community level social connections that create a sense of belongingness that are so crucial to our physical, mental, and emotional health. One study found that a lack of belongingness, a lack of those broader social connections, can be as detrimental to your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Withdrawal for self-soothing and downshifting the nervous system is a healthy response to stress overwhelm. But when chronic stress turns into chronic isolation, it can actually make things worse. So how do we find balance in this new world that we're living in? How do we find a way to downshift the nervous system, to stay slower, to move through the world at the rate that our bodies and minds and spirits need now, without isolating and introducing the chronic stress of isolation? How do we find our way back to connection without overwhelming our stress response? In her book, Atlas of the Heart, Brené Brown writes about mapping our emotions in order to understand them. She notes that people will do almost anything to not feel pain, including numbing pain, avoiding pain, and causing pain. We would rather shut down all the feelings or push them onto somebody else than feel the hardest ones. However, Brown's studies also showed that naming the feelings, naming them, giving language to them, and mapping our experiences of them gave people a sense of control in those feelings, gave them agency, and helped the feelings become more manageable. Through mapping, people were able to find their way back to experiencing life and to making meaning out of those experiences. Brown uses the metaphor of a map throughout her book, Atlas of the Heart. And as such, she interviews the expert cartographer, Dr. Kirk Goldsberry of the University of Texas at Austin, who tells her maps are the most important documents in human history. They give us tools, and they store and exchange knowledge about space and place. They give us tools, and they store and exchange knowledge about space and place. They are a way for us to make meaning together. In our journey to membership class here at church, we have people create a map of their spiritual journey. We ask them, how have you arrived here and now? What have the spiritual turning points of your journey to this moment been? When are those moments when you made a big decision that turned your life irrevocably in a new direction, or found a new spiritual practice that you return to again and again now for sustenance? Or when a person or a piece of music or a book or a piece of art affected you so deeply that it changed who you are and how you show up in the world? What are your spiritual turning points? What is the map of experience that led you here to this moment right now? We also ask our new members to draw a map of what they want their future spiritual journey to be, and what kinds of experiences they hope to have here at church to help them along that journey. We ask questions like, what relational or spiritual experiences do you want to have? In what ways do you hope to grow? What gifts would it feel good to offer the community? How will you balance your journey of giving and receiving in community? Grace Lee Boggs was one of the leading organizers of the 20th century. She worked for the rights of African American people and women and people of color and youth. She was an author and a philosopher, and she taught generations of young activists and inspired the work of thousands for a better future. I had the privilege of meeting Boggs when she was in her 80s. And she was still inviting groups of activists to come to her Detroit home. My nuclear abolition young adult group, Think Outside the Bomb. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. We literally sat at Grace Lee Boggs' feet, trying to soak in her wisdom. She asked us, "What time is it on the clock of the world?" and talked with us about our dreams of a nuclear-free future. We were in awe of her and all she had done to make the world better. Adrienne Marie Brown recounts her own experience with Grace Lee Boggs in Emergent Strategy, and she remembers Boggs having a sign on her wall in her home in Detroit that said, "Building community is to the collective as spiritual practice is to the individual." Building community is to the collective as spiritual practice is to the individual. We are in this work of building community together. When we show up at church, it is not just to experience our own internal spiritual epiphany, experience, movement, journey. It is also to be part of a community as a collective spiritual practice. Boggs lived that practice. She took time out of her life until she was in her 90s, meeting group after group of organizers and inviting them into her home to ponder and connect and keep building wider and wider circles of community. Building community is our collective spiritual practice as a congregation. We rest the meaning of our lives here together. We find our way together. We chart the map and make the course together. Belongingness is not something that is hoisted upon you. Belongingness that is so essential for your well-being is something that you create. It is something that we create together as a spiritual practice by flexing the muscle of connection. That muscle might be a little out of practice right now. It's possible that we need to go to the spiritual gym together, and that's okay. That is a normal part of the journey that we've been on, where our rock got smashed and scattered, and we're gathering back in. Spiritual practice is not easy stuff. If it was, everyone would be meditating every morning, or doing yoga every afternoon, or saying grace before dinner every night. Everyone would be engaged in complex, diverse spiritual community. The benefits of spiritual practice are so clear and so well documented that we would all be doing it if it was easy peasy. But it's not. Practice takes practice. It takes discipline and commitment. You have to keep showing up even when it's dry or difficult, or it would be easier to not do the practice, which honestly is most of the time. If I didn't meditate every time there was a good reason not to, I would not have a daily meditation practice. I would have a twice monthly meditation practice. With building community, it is even more important to show up because deep relationships of trust are built on regular time spent together. I know I'm going on sabbatical soon, and I'll be gone for 5 months, but honestly, church is not about me. It's about you. It's about your relationships with each other. You are the ones who are in the deep spiritual practice of building community. The relationships among you are the ones that form the basis of that community. As Amanda and Tony Pansiera said up here last week in their Forge Our Future testimonial, the church is really built up from the everydays. From the daily practice, from the weekly practice of showing up and connecting. The week before that, Dale Skaggs told us a story in his Forge Our Future testimonial about a cathedral in Ireland that's been standing for 1,300 years. It's shaped like a dome, and it's held up for 1,300 years, long before the days of concrete, because thousands of small rocks act among the big rocks as mortar. They hold the large stones together into walls. Those small pieces, the everydays, the daily practice piled in and among the larger stones, those are the foundation of trust. They are what hold us together over the long haul. And yes, there are those big boulders that Amanda and Tony talked about as well, the boulders that make up the cathedral of your experiences, the turning points, a loved one's death, a baby's birth, the time you had a life-changing epiphany, a wedding date. But those boulders are held together by hundreds, thousands of small rock days. Every day's in and among the larger pieces. So yeah, we're here for each other on the big days. We show up for the memorial services and the child dedications and the graduations, but we also show up for each other on the regular Sundays, the everydays, the board meetings, the finance team, the theme circles, the religious education, our whole lives. How do we find our way back to community? And how do we find our way forward together? There's a story about a little girl who was playing while her dad was reading the newspaper, and she kept trying to get his attention over and over. Dad, 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 Dad. And eventually, Dad came up with a game that he thought would keep her busy for a little while. He tore off a piece of the newspaper he was reading that had a map on it, a map of a faraway place that he was pretty sure his daughter didn't know. And he tore that map into a bunch of different sizes and shapes and gave it all to his daughter as a puzzle. He told her, "Put this map back together." So she happily trotted off with the puzzle to play this new game, and Dad figured he had, at least 20 or 30 minutes while she figured out how to put that map back together, but she trotted back to him 5 minutes later with the map perfectly assembled completely. Dad was a little shocked and rather impressed. He thought maybe I have a map-making savant on my hands. He asked her how she did it. Have you seen a map of this place before? Did you learn about this place in school? And the girl said, Dad, on the other side, there's a picture of a person's face. And I know what a person's face looks like. I want to tell you a little story about the unofficial deacon of First Church, Dale Skaggs. I can't tell you the number of times somebody in this congregation has told me about a time that Dale saved their heart, or their marriage, or their spirit, or their life. That Dale changed who they are, was part of their spiritual turning points in their journey, their map of experience. It has happened over and over again with people of all different ages and races from all different parts of the church and walks of life at all different times. Things that happened 10 years ago, things that happened last week. And what I want to tell you about is that it doesn't happen by accident. Dale doesn't just happen to be at the right place at the right time all the time. It's on purpose. Dale makes a point to come to church as many Sundays as he can, and sometimes he comes to both services, but not for himself. He comes for you. He comes to show up for the community, to show up for the people in the pews, and then he pays attention. He watches for who might need a little extra something that morning, who's looking lost or down or troubled. And then he checks in, and he sees what's going on and shows up and stays present and helps them process whatever is on their heart. The fact that Dale is part of the map of so many people's journey, so many people's spiritual turning point, isn't by accident. Community doesn't happen by accident. It's intentional. It's a practice of showing up again and again, over and over, when you need it, but also when you don't, and you think someone else might need you, and you're available. We will find our way back to community, back to each other, and our way forward through the map of one another's faces. We will find our way home to life-saving, extending community and belongingness through the everydays of showing up and engaging in the collective spiritual practice of community building. We don't need to go fast. It doesn't need to be guilt or shame-based. It doesn't need to be hurried. You can show up when you do have something available, when you can. You can show up when you're in need and you're going to receive. And in fact, church is better that way. Church is better when we go slow and are unhurried and are moving at the pace of our own hearts so that we can be receptive and patient and reflective and loving with one another. It helps us focus and make meaning together, in contrast to a busy and hurried outside world. We can take it slow, and we can slowly put together the map again through the connection of one another's faces. May it be so.